Or are there any other items that commissioners would want to talk about during the briefing meeting? All right, then we will follow the agenda as it's published. Are there any questions about any items on the agenda for our meeting this evening? All right, great. Okay, the first item on our agenda under staff updates is the discussion of the bond funding criteria.
Well, I can introduce myself in the meantime. I'm Jill Carter. I am the project manager for the Open Space Bond, and I am here today with Thomas Gull from the Parks and Recreation Department to present the evaluation criteria for Greenway's projects to be funded through the bond. Just to start, I'll give a brief update on where things stand with the bond, and then we want to give an overview of how Greenway's project funding works before moving into talking about our process for developing the criteria and the criteria itself. As a quick refresher, we are in the process of developing the selection criteria and getting that through approval for the 3 components of the open space bond. This criteria will be used by staff to score project proposals before advisory boards for each component select which projects they'd like to recommend for funding. And then ultimately, the commissioners will select which projects they would like to approve. We have already had the conservation easement criteria adopted, and we are now moving forward with greenways, and then we will follow with the passive recreation lands criteria. We do anticipate that all criteria will be complete by late summer, early fall time. Before we go into the Greenways criteria, I want to take a moment to just talk about the process for funding Greenways projects. There's 2 main avenues through which these projects typically get funded. The first is locally funded projects in which the local government provides the majority of funding. This funding can be accompanied by local grant funds and other local sources. But because the local government foots the majority of the bill, there's a lot more flexibility in how they can select which projects to prioritize. There's also fewer restrictions and regulations that must be met. And as such, the process from planning through construction completion typically moves a lot more quickly. But again, the local government is footing most of the bill on those. The other process is funding through the MPO, or the Metropolitan Planning Organization. In this case, about 80% of the funding is provided from either state or federal sources, and then the local government provides a 20% match. In this case, the projects are prioritized through 2 lists called the STIP and the MTP. And the MPO has a pretty involved process for prioritizing projects. There's a number of approvals and restrictions that projects have to go through on the state and federal level to make it onto those lists. And as such, the process typically takes a lot longer. Additionally, we are beholden to the MPO's process in terms of when those projects move forward. At the end of this presentation in the appendix, there is a list of projects in Buncombe County that are on those 2 priority lists. And you can see kind of the estimated completion dates that the MPO has assigned to them. Now, we wanted to share this information because it will impact what projects we see come forward for bond funding, and the timing and cost implications of those projects will depend largely on how we want to fund them. Additionally, there are 3 shovel-ready projects in Buncombe County that we are going to request to use bond funds for. These are the Highway 251 section and Beaver Dam Creek section of the Woodfin Greenway and the Inca Heritage Trail. All 3 of these projects are on those MPO priority lists, so we are providing that 20% match for the local, or the state and federal funding rather. Once these projects are completed, we will then open a request for proposal for new projects to receive the remaining bond funds. However, we did want to go ahead and move forward with the criteria that will be used for that RFP, which is what you'll be seeing tonight, because presenting it now and sharing it with the public will allow potential applicants to build out their proposals and get things in line for when we open the application. For the criteria itself, our staff initially developed a list of high-level criteria that you can see on the left here. And we brought that criteria to the public, to our advisory board, and to key community stakeholders to get their input on what should be included in these criteria and how they should be prioritized. We engaged in a public engagement process whereby we had public meetings, we had an input survey, and we also had presentations with our Recreation Advisory Board to get their feedback on the criteria. In our survey, we asked respondents to rank the criteria in order of importance. And as you can see, they ranked connectivity and environmental impact highest. We also asked what criteria was not included on this list that they felt should be added. And by far and away, the top was safety. There's a lot of concern around wanting to ensure that users on these greenways are safe from vehicles, safe from crime, safe from potential accidents. And based on this public engagement process, we did revise the criteria into what I'm going to share with you now. So we then finalized the criteria into a set of qualifying criteria and 2 options for weighted criteria. The qualifying criteria is a yes or no question. Projects must meet these criteria in order to move forward for consideration. So these are leveraging of bond funds. We want to ensure that projects are leveraging funds from other sources and not relying entirely on the bond. Can the project be completed within the timeline restrictions of the bond? As you know, we have 7 to max 10 years to allocate these funds, and we need to make sure that these projects can meet that timeline. Is there a feasibility study completed? We do not want to be using bond funds to fund feasibility studies because we don't want to potentially have projects that got bond funds but can't be finished. And then finally, is the project located within Buncombe County? Many greenways go across counties, but we want to make sure that the portion that is receiving bond funds is located within Buncombe. And as I said, these are yes or no questions. So if a project answers no to any of these, it will not move forward for consideration. Now we also have developed weighted criteria. These criteria are judged on a scale. So how well a project meets one of these criterion, it will determine how many points it gets for that piece. So in other words, if a greenway connects to a lot of different community centers and neighborhoods, it would score higher on the connectivity criterion. Now we do have 2 different options. The criteria within these options is the same, but the weighting is what differs. So I'll just briefly go through those criteria. First, again, is connectivity. We want to see projects that are connected to different neighborhoods, connecting communities to other communities. We want to see projects that connect to business and social centers. And we also want to see projects that are connecting to other greenways and trail systems and multimodal transportation systems. Second, we have environmental impact, both in terms of how does the project minimize its negative environmental impact and potential positive impacts, things like pollinator gardens or planting native species. Next, we have accessibility. We want to ensure that these greenways are accessible to all within Buncombe County, regardless of physical ability, financial capacity, geographic location. Feasibility. Obviously, we have feasibility study as one of those qualifying criteria, but also projects can vary in how feasible they are because of things like topography or partner support. Also, not all feasibility studies are created equal. We want to see feasibility studies that are more recent and more detailed as well. Identified as countywide need, opportunity, and priority. We heard a lot from the community that there's a desire for a system of greenways and being very strategic in how we allocate these funds. So we want to ensure that they are aligning with things like the comprehensive plan, the Parks and Recreation plan, and other county needs and priorities. Equity, we want to see projects that are benefiting historically underserved communities. We also want to see projects that are engaging with the communities they're in and how they are designed, making sure that we are minimizing potential negative impacts on those communities, but also providing services throughout our county. And then leveraging bond funds and project costs. While, again, this is also a qualifying criteria, we do want to be able to give more priority to projects that leverage more funds and are more strategic in their cost allocations. And then finally, as you saw in the public engagement, safety was a big concern, so we have added safety as a criteria. Now, the two options that are here before you, they do differ in the weight of these criteria. Option one was allocated based on the feedback we received and how the public kind of ranked the criteria in priority. And then option two, we received a request to up the weight of feasibility and leveraging and costs, largely like meeting the desire to have projects that can be executed and executed in a reasonable time frame. So in order to add that additional weight, we removed 1 percentage point from each of the other 6 criterion and added 3 to feasibility and 3 to leveraging. So tonight we are hoping to get a bit of a direction in terms of which option we should bring forward for adoption eventually. And then just kind of next steps, ideally we would be coming back to this board on the August 1st meeting for adoption, and then continuing to move forward with those shovel-ready projects. And I yield for any questions.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. Commissioners, any questions? I've got just a few comments. I mean, partly, so the Environmental and Energy Committee reviewed this as part of the process. So I'll just kind of share a few, so we had a chance to sort of preview this. A couple of comments on it. First, I mean, the scoring differentials in terms of these two options are not very far apart, so I don't think this is like making a very significant change one way or the other. But I mean, speaking for myself, but I think also just part of the thoughts from the Energy and Environmental Committee is that, these Greenway projects are not easy to get done, right? Like, I've been on the county commission since 2012, and we've been talking about these 3 projects, well, not all 3 of them the whole time, but certainly several of them were, and they were there before I got here, right? These were not ideas that I came up with. I mean, they were previous county commissions came up with some of these ideas, and none of them have been, started yet. So I think part of just the feedback is like, we need to be like, we love these mountains, this is where we all want to be. Building greenways, ADA accessible, 10, 12-foot wide paved greenways in the mountains in urban settings in particular is really hard from a regulatory standpoint. If you're using these federal funds, you got to follow all these, federal processes for evaluation of them. And all this stuff has gotten, I mean, I remember when we were first starting this, and the parks director back then was like, these, y'all need to be ready. These are going to cost $1 million a mile. And we were all like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. Like, we wish we could take that deal now, right? Like, they're way, way more than that. So anyway, I think part of the feedback from the committee was just, when we think about, there's the projects that we're already working on. Of course, we want to see the bond funds used to help support getting those to go forward. And hopefully there'll be some funding left over from that, but I guess we'll see once it's all said and done. But if there is, that we need to place a lot of weight on, when we think about new projects, what are the opportunities in the county for projects that can really get done, right? Because there's a lot of ideas and like our vision documents and stuff, there's a lot of lines that have been drawn on maps. But sometimes when you go out there and you look at kind of what the land looks like in some of these locations, it's like, wow, that is going to be really tough to build and maybe very expensive to build when you start thinking about retaining walls and things like this. So I think part of our just general feedback is that we really need to take a really practical approach to thinking about what additional projects that we want to take on at the county level. So in terms of that, placing more weight on feasibility, that's kind of the spirit of where that's coming from, right? And just kind of acknowledging, like, we haven't made the kind of progress to date that we would like to, so when we take on new projects, let's make sure we're taking on something that we can actually follow through on. And specifically just kind of thinking about the meeting we had and then the criteria here, I think the staff noted this at our meeting, I mean, the feasibility criteria, we're saying you have to have a feasibility study to even qualify. So putting weight on it from that standpoint actually doesn't, I mean, they're always going to have to answer yes to that question, or it's just taken off the list, right? So I guess just, I don't know, my suggestion would be, rather than having that be one of the yes/no criteria, I mean, if the answer is no, there's no feasibility study, then yeah, it wouldn't be considered at this time. But if it is a yes, it's more of like a follow-up to that. Like, how feasible is it? Is this a project that, based on all the information that we have, the staff or whoever's working on the project believes, like, this is a project we have high confidence we could implement in the next 3 to 4 years, or 3 to 6 years, or 6 to 10 years. Like, how, so if there's projects that, and especially if they're scoring well in all these other categories, that we think we could accomplish over a 3 to 5 year period, like, that would rank really high. But another project that might score very well in all these other areas, but if we really don't think, for various reasons, it's going to happen for the next 7, 8, 9, 10 years, that would make a big difference, right? So I don't know, that's kind of how I've thought about the feasibility piece. It's not just kind of this yes, no, but like, really, for the feasibility studies, what do they tell us about how realistic it is? So anyway, that's just some feedback on that point. And then on the other one, on the leveraging of bond funds and project costs, well, actually, I don't think I have anything else to say on that point. But just obviously, there's just a huge range in the cost variations of this. I mean, if you're on flat land, the cost is just very, very different than steep hillsides and stuff like that. So that's sort of the argument because we're not going to have a lot of bond funds left after we pay for the other projects. So if one project does cost, $2 million a mile, and another one costs $5 million a mile, like, that should matter a lot, because otherwise we're just not going to see very much actually get built. So anyway, that's kind of my 2 cents on this. Other questions or comments from commission members?
I think that summed up what we discussed in our meeting pretty well. And I do really appreciate staff bringing this to us, and all the thought that's gone into this, and all the community input as well. And we're definitely excited to see some of these greenways come to completions, as I know you all are as well.
I would say that my one comment is we're hoping to get some direction on those 2 options, if there is a preference for the one with the increased weights, or if the original option. Per Commissioner Newman's statement, our thinking of including feasibility and costs in both the weighted and the qualifying was that kind of adds an additional emphasis on those 2. And the weighted criteria in option 2 also adds a little more oomph to those 2 pieces as well. But we would love to get a direction.
But, okay, on this question, though, about if the answer has to be a yes on feasibility, otherwise it's just not considered, then I don't quite understand giving it weight if it's
Sure.
if it's a kind of a pass-fail kind of criteria.
So similar to what you were saying as well, the yes or no question is if there's a feasibility study completed.
Mhm.
If there's not one, then it wouldn't move forward. But in the weighted, that kind of lends to your question of, there could be 2 projects that both have feasibility studies, but one might be much more easy to complete because the topography allows for that, it's got stakeholder
Okay.
support, and so on. And so that would score higher on the weighted criteria than the other project.
Okay, all right. And so that would be fleshed out in those ways. So it would be kind of ranked. It's not just a pass-fail. It's like you could
Exactly.
get some points, or all the points, or very few points, depending on
Exactly.
how doable it is. Okay. All right. Well, I mean, I guess I'll just, for the reasons I just prattled on about, I mean, I am in favor of the second weight. Just because I think the feasibility, these are all great criteria, but I just feel like achievability really just does warrant strong consideration. So I'm for option 2. Any other people want to argue any other sides of it or weigh in on it? We do need to give some direction on this, so whichever way we go. So any other thoughts on this?
I'm supportive of option 2.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. Is that that's it? Okay, great. Hey, thank you. Great presentation. All right. The next item is the Fire Prevention and Protection Ordinance.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Kevin Tipton, Fire Marshal for Buncombe County. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation this afternoon. These are some proposed changes to the ordinance. There's been no major ordinance revision since 2007. We are required to align to state standards in certain things as prescribed by the State Fire Marshal's Office. And we need to safeguard and meet our mission of preventing loss of life and preserving our property in Buncombe County. This will increase the opportunities to enhance resident and visitor safety, and it'll provide service and education to businesses and external and internal customers as well. We consider our other agencies in Buncombe County our customers as well as our businesses. Last year, North Carolina Fire Chief Consultants came in and did a study of the Fire Marshal's Office. Their final report was very extensive, but I am grateful for that report. It gave us a roadmap for improvement. Investigations and requirements of duties, periodic inspections and frequencies, that's all in the ordinance. Remediation, fire code violations, and lastly is a new open burning ordinance that we've never had in Buncombe County. And when we get to that part, I have Ashley Featherstone with Air Quality with me. All the proposed revisions and updates are in red. This is just an example of some of the things that have changed. The duties are outlined in the new ordinance of the fire marshal or his designee is worded in there. The first item addressed in this slide is our fines. These are fire code violations. These are not fees that you would normally see on a fee schedule. In 2007, $100, I get a business owner considered a lot of money. I've had business owners in the last 18 months tell me that they can afford to pay the $100 a day for 2 weeks. They're not in a hurry to fix a major violation. $500 per violation has a little more bite, and that is life safety violations. That's blocking of exit doors, blocking of ingress, egress of fire apparatus. It's not like the movies. We don't find exit doors chained shut anymore since the Hamlet fire in North Carolina of old. And the $100 for every other violation, that would be something like the exit light back there is out and continuously out repeatedly. First, I've got to say we don't walk into a business and start issuing violations. We use education and collaboration, and the fines are the very last resort we would use with one of our customers. They've just flat ignored our request, ignored our educational efforts. Some of the other changes in this ordinance is, again, wording. The service of the inspection report, it had no wording. We were killing trees, printing out inspection reports because the wording wasn't in here that we could email them an electronic report, and that's required by the state that we have to provide that service delivery in our ordinance. The third thing you see here, these are just the biggest examples. The Emergency Services Director. In the past, the Emergency Services Director was the fire marshal. He provided his report to the county manager of fire marshal activities. Taylor Jones, of course, our Emergency Services Director, who's been very supportive and had a big supporting role in this ordinance. This is something we're already doing. It just needs to be in the ordinance. He gets a report from me at the beginning of every month of everything our office has done in the last calendar month, and he gets a yearly report of our activity. But again, the ordinance said the report should go to the county manager. We have appendices in our codes. We have some wording changes here about hazardous material. The old ordinance, the fire marshal may, that's not in line with our current fire code. Our current fire code says the fire marshal shall instruct a business to meet NFPA 74. These are all just minor examples of the ordinance. Talk just a minute about Appendix B and Appendix D of the fire code. These were partially adopted in 2007 when Edward Sally was our deputy fire marshal. We just had a few sentences of each appendices adopted into our county ordinance. And for me to enforce these these codes out of the fire code, they must be in our fire prevention ordinance. State law again requires this. Appendix B is water flow, fire flow required to put out a fire at that structure. And again, I'm not talking about single family, I'm talking about commercial apartments, multifamily residential, nursing homes, care facilities, schools. Appendix B addresses the water that's required to address a fire in that structure. I don't see any leadway in deviating any from Appendix B, and I could stand here and read it to you, but your meeting would start very late tonight. Appendix D is access requirements. It's what the fire service requires to access a commercial or apartment building. Most of it's 20 feet. If it's more than 3 stories, it's 24 to 26 feet. As you can imagine, that gets challenging in the mountains. Buncombe County and our planning department has been great partners in keeping development off of our steep slopes. However, I can't enforce the entirety of the access requirements without adoption into the ordinance. There is talk in Raleigh of moving this in the 2024 code cycle and taking it out of the appendices into the main body of the code, but in the meantime, that 2024 code may not be adopted until July 1st of 2025, just because of the cycle it goes through with our legislatures. I want to talk to you about open burning. I have Ashley Featherstone here with me. These two ordinances will work in conjunction with each other. Buncombe County has never had an open burning ordinance. Just a little bit of background, I get an average of 30 complaints a month for smoke. Got 6 last night off of one fire. To address this, I really need an ordinance to address open burning. And this is not a legal burning. This is addressing legal burning, not the burning of tires or the burning of building materials. This ordinance addresses vegetative waste that it's perfectly legal to burn. However, there are some restrictions that the fire code recommends. And again, it starts out with kindle or maintain or authorized to be kindle any open burning without it meets the proposed open burning ordinance and the air quality ordinance. It gives me a little bit of authority over open burning. It gives us some extinguishment authority. It talks about permits for open burning. It gives the minimum required setbacks that are straight out of the fire code. We have some developments. I've dealt with several. You're not able to build within 10 feet of your lot line, but there's nothing other than this that says your burning has to be X amount of feet from your lot line. And it becomes a nuisance for our residents. We still have permit requirements on open burning. Most of those are bonfires. We still have some of those for our schools. We have exceptions in here for the chimney devices, the wood pellet containers those are great, by the way. They're getting very popular because they emit no smoke. And it includes violations, civil and criminal violations that can come from this. This open burning ordinance, again, is very lax. And we will be bringing this back to you for a possible request for board action on August 1st. If it's approved, we'll develop and implement a public education campaign. We'll work with our CAPE partners. We'll get this out through word of mouth, through social media, make sure our contractors and land clearing agencies are aware of it. And we're not even going to start enforcing this for 30 days. Just a little bit about where this comes from, and I'll finish up. I started gathering data about 9 months ago, this from our surrounding counties, our border counties, and as far away as Pender County. I think I read 27 different ordinances from various counties. Some of them were as small as 2 pages, some of them were 70 pages. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel, but I am trying to cut down on nuisance burning. We are a county. I know it's impossible to provide yard waste pickup. I've watched you as commissioners struggle with our solid waste contracts. I can't imagine trying to come up with a yard waste program for a county the size of Buncombe. But again, I have Ashley with me. Our ordinances work together. And I think she's very pleased about some parts of this. It's been presented to the Air Quality Advisory Board, which I hold a seat on and attend their meetings. They were very receptive to it, and I appreciate your time, and I'll answer any questions you may have about any of this proposed change.
All right.
Yeah, I have
Yeah.
a couple of questions. So on the bonfires, recreational fires, are you saying you're doing away with those or you're permitting? I'm not clear on what you're
No,
saying.
ma'am.
right there.
If the fire meets the size requirements, it's required to have a permit. For example, T.C. Robertson's band program does a bonfire every year. I go out and inspect that. I issue them a permit. I make sure it's safe and make sure they meet their extinguishment authority. Extinguishment authority is a big part of that open burning ordinance. Fire chief went out last night. They had no extinguishment authority because that burn was legal. With this ordinance, a fire chief from any district in our county or his designee, which would be the captain of an engine or the driver of the engine, would have the authority to say, we're putting this fire out.
Okay, and then thank you, that helped. And then, so the prohibited open burn in non-vegetative waste, can you clarify?
I'm gonna let Ashley speak to that. I don't know her ordinance per word or per verbatim. My ordinance addresses legal burning, air quality addresses illegal burning.
Correct. So under our ordinances, the only thing that's legal to burn is vegetative material that grows on your property, typical at residences. And then, of course, there's land clearing, open burning. So I think the main point is the only thing that's legal is naturally occurring vegetation.
Okay. So what is being burnt, I'm just curious, what is being burnt that isn't naturally occurring vegetation that's causing the problem?
Well, typically, we do see people burning household trash and construction debris and things of that nature. So we do have some overlap in our ordinances. And air quality works very closely with the fire marshal's office and the fire departments. The fire departments go out on most of the complaints, and they provide reports to us and help get the word out, because the air quality rules cover what's legal to burn, like vegetation versus synthetic materials not being legal, whereas the fire marshal is more addressing the safety factors and more fire safety.
Okay, thank you.
We do work together a lot, and we were very supportive. Appreciate the opportunity to review the ordinance and get it updated. And there's some factors that they've added, like the extinguishment authority and also requiring fires to be attended. It's been a problem for air quality and the fire departments for a long time. So we're very supportive to see these updates.
A couple questions. I guess mine are pertaining to buildings and specifically residential. In terms of the safety requirements that you, Kevin, that you spoke to in the beginning, does that apply to residential rental properties?
It
Just commercial.
does,
Okay,
if you don't maintain the 10 feet setbacks for 3x3 fires.
okay,
And the ordinance in itself will be entirely complaint-driven. We're not gonna go out and search for people that's got a fire 8 feet from their residence versus 10 feet or 12 feet versus 15, depending on the size fire. This is totally to address our citizens and provide customer service to them when we get the complaints. And
I got you, but the Appendix B, I think you spoke to, that applies to commercial buildings, is that,
the
That's
Appendix
just-
B is
yeah.
fire flow. The water required to run that sprinkler system, meet domestic demand of those water lines, and provide a gallon per minute flow to fight a fire without the neighbors down the road being out of water, without the water lines collapsing, without having to bring in extra water. If you are on a hydrated system such as the city of Asheville, Woodfin, town of Black Mountain, Appendix B says that water main has to provide X number of gallons for this proposed structure, and that's all figured by a fire protection engineer.
okay. I guess what I'm getting at is either through this new code or through our minimum housing code, or I think we have a rental property code, some rental ordinance. Do any of those ordinances, existing or proposed, protect renters? People living in residential rental properties in any way?
The fire prevention ordinance would protect them from open burning, becoming a nuisance. Now, as for the rental agreement or rental housing ordinance, I can't speak to that any longer. That was moved to permits and inspections, I think, 2 years ago.
Okay,
That used to be under our purview, and I'm sorry that there was a big change in legislation.
the
And
160.
I'd be remiss not to mention that in 2010 to 2012, legislation chose to get involved with open burning and air quality regulations. They stripped a lot of what was then Buncombe County Pollution Controls Authority, and then they wound up getting reverted back to the fire code to try to enforce.
I have one more question, actually.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you elaborate on the required prescribed burning for wildfire and eradication?
We don't see a whole lot of that around here, but an invasive plant, I know you come from a farming community out in Sandy Mush. An invasive plant gets into a pasture or a field. Some of these, and I'm not trying to be an agriculturalist, but some of these plants, the only way to eradicate them is to burn them. And the fire code is very specific. For range management or eradication of an invasive plant or invasive species, you must get a permit to conduct that. That's not agricultural burning, that's not the burning of the corn stalks or what have you from the farms in your area. But if you had to burn off 10 acres because of an invasive plant species, then it would be required to get a permit from our office. I'm not gonna say it's not gonna happen here after COVID, because anything can happen here after COVID. But a lot of that is from out west, the range fire management.
All right, any other questions? Okay, great presentation. Thanks for the updates. Look forward to discussing further.
Thank you.
All right, commissioners, that's everything that was on our agenda. We do have a need for a closed session prior to our regular meeting at 5. Mr. Free, would you tell us about the purpose of it?
Yes, sir. Board needs to make a motion to go into closed session pursuant to 143, 318, 11A6 to discuss personnel matters with the board. And expect no action outside of that, just to continue with them, to adjourn and come back.
Okay, great. Is there a motion to go into closed session?
Second.
All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right.